Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. We're a few minutes early. We're going to start this webinar at 12, which by my watch is about 3 minutes away. We appreciate your coming today. And if you have any questions, we'd love to get your questions. Please put them in the Q&A, and we will get them at the end of the session. I'll repeat that again later when we have more people in the session. But for those of you who are early birds, appreciate you coming, and we'll get started in a minute. Michael and Leon, thank you so much for being part of this. Well, I'll do formal introductions of you in a few minutes. But tell us, for the audience, I'm coming to you from Brooklyn, New York. Michael, where are you coming to us from?
Right now, I'm in Dayton, Ohio.
Dayton, Ohio. And Leon?
Hi, everybody. I'm in Central California and been out here most of my life, but I've lived and worked abroad on sustainability-related work and on the East Coast as well.
Great. Yeah. Okay, we've still got some more people joining us. We'll start in a minute. And thank you all for joining us on this beautiful day. At least it is on the East Coast. I don't know. How is it on the West Coast, Leon?
It's awesome, as it usually is.
You didn't have to do that.
Well, we've also, we don't have any wildfires going on either. So,
oh, yeah, that's a plus.
I might have just, that could change in 5 minutes, though.
Well, we don't have any floods going on here in New York.
Yeah, you guys got smacked pretty hard.
We did, yeah. For those of you coming to us from New York, I'm glad that we're all dry, and seems like a subway day that is not too chaotic. So that's a plus. All right, so I got us about a minute before. We'll get going in a minute. People are joining still. Michael or Leon, any thoughts about anti-woke society that you want to say before we get started?
I think we should wait till everybody gets in so nobody misses any of the juicy bits.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, everybody, thank you for coming. Or for those of you who are just joining us, we're going to start in a minute. And as I said just a minute ago, and I'll say it again in a minute, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A at any time during the session. We will have about 20 minutes at the end of the session or so, maybe 30, to go over the questions. So really would love you to participate and jot down any questions you have that come up during the session, and we'll get to them at the end. And if there's something that's really needing me to break in, and because it's part of what somebody's just spoken about, I will ask a question at that point too. Okay, I've got us close to noon here. All right, so why don't we get started? It's good to get started right on time. Thank you, everybody, for coming. As you can see, this webinar by CSR Talent Group is called Communications in an Anti-Woke Society. And I'm going to say it one more time for those of you who joined earlier. I'm sorry, this is the third time I've said it, but we're asking people to send us questions and put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. So welcome, everyone. We're pleased to have you join us for this next hour, and we hope you'll walk away with some practical ideas and insights that will help you and your company move forward. We've developed our Insider Insights webinar series to provide unique perspectives of the consultants in our network, of which we have over 200 in our current network, who've also worked in companies and agencies. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for changing that. We have about 200 vetted CSR, ESG, and sustainability experts. And as you can see, at least 95% have worked across multiple corporate environments. And what's unique about us is that given the breadth and depth of our network, we can customize our work and find consultants that can be customized to your company's unique maturity, goals, and timeline, whatever you need. The Insider Insights session that we're providing through this webinar, we think provides pretty unique perspectives because we're able to bring different consultants with deep experience to provide their thoughts and their perspectives on a particular issue, like today's webinar. And we hope that you can walk away with some actionable insights. We'll be talking about some big picture issues today, but also we want you to feel like these sessions, these webinars are a chance for you to ask questions that will help you think about your current situation and walk away with some action steps. Because we know that the different companies and some of the consultants that are joining this webinar come from a range of experiences and approaches and are different places in their timeline and their communication career and approach. And also I want to mention now too that we have webinars coming up every month. Our next one after this one is on November 16th at 12 noon, and it's called Harnessing Your ESG Reporting in a Rapidly Changing Landscape. We know that a lot of companies are dealing with pressure on to look at different frameworks and standards, and it can be a very confusing landscape. We've got a consultant that's going to lay that out for us and tell us a little bit more about how to approach the different requirements as well as the different standards and frameworks that your company may be thinking about. Let me take a moment now to introduce our panelists, our speakers. Michael Holland is a trusted advisor to business, government, and nonprofit leaders who are working towards achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Earlier in his career, Michael was an executive vice president at Edelman and led the firm's largest CSR and sustainability team after directing Honeywell's social impact initiatives in more than 100 countries. Leon Kay has been on both the editorial and public relations sides of sustainability communications since 2009. He's worked with APCO Worldwide in Abu Dhabi on a global green building and clean energy initiative. And Leon's also written for The Guardian, Sustainable Brands, and TriplePundit.com. Based in California, he's currently a strategic communications consultant partnering with global corporations. Michael and Leon, thank you both for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. Once again, I'll say it again. Any questions you have, we'd really love to see. We've got a bunch of questions already from panelists, from attendees. Please put any question you have in the Q&A. And we're recording the session for those who wanted to attend, but their schedules didn't permit. This will be posted on our website with an executive summary, so just feel free to take a look at that or tell your colleagues to take a look at that when they have a minute. So let's get started. Michael and Leon will present slides for about the next 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for Q&A for the final 30 minutes. So again, please send questions via the Q&A. Michael, do you want to start us off?
Sure, absolutely. And if there's any jumbling, or if I'm not in focus or audio, please let me know. Yeah, and wonderful to be a part of this. And Tom, thanks so much for organizing a very timely and important conversation on this topic. And I want to share a perspective, and then certainly I'll turn it over to Leon for his thoughts. And I realize that there's so much variability here, depending on your company, your industry, your customers, whether you're consumer facing, where you're located. So we'll hopefully tease some of that out when we get to the Q&A. But for now, sort of looking, broad range of perspective on what I see in the marketplace and what I've seen has been successful in the work I've done internally or with clients or over the past few years. As I was getting ready for today, I was certainly reflecting on what's been happening with Disney, Target, and with Anheuser-Busch. And we as practitioners are always focused on lists, and we aspire to be on lists to be validated and recognized in the marketplace. So I was curious as to whether or not there was a list of woke companies. And sure enough, American Conservative Values Fund does indeed, I'm sure there may be another list, but does indeed have a list of companies that they will not invest in as they perceive are being aggressively progressive or liberal, taking social positions. And certainly as you look, it's easy to do the compare and contrast to, in this case, Fortune's Most Admired. And one could argue that the very things that companies are striving for in terms of the recognition in the marketplace for the business strategy, the quality of the leadership team, for the product portfolio, treatment of employees, treatment of communities, all those things are the very same things that a segment of society is going to criticize and attack for. And in a small way, it certainly speaks to what we're really fundamentally, I think all of us are seeing, is that there's so much division, or at least we see in the media, we see out on social media, this what appears to be this rampant division and polarization in society. And sometimes it's hard to get away from that. And obviously, I think, unfortunately, we can look at over the course of the next 12 months and recognize that as the presidential campaign, electoral cycle really speeds up, that companies are really going to be caught in the middle. And it raises all additional risks and vulnerabilities as social issues really become central to party platforms and what candidates are saying, and how that plays out. And there's also, not to try to sound flippant here, but as I see interviews, as I see what's happening in social media or conversations, I also step back and wonder if, this sort of, I don't know what it is, but I'm sure I'm against it syndrome. And I feel like there are times that you hear and see what people are saying, and you step back and you wonder, do they really understand the nuances? Do they understand the issue? Do you understand what the companies are doing, what their strategies are? So on one hand, I'm sure you're all seeing this too. On one hand, we've got this very challenging, complex, sometimes toxic environment. And then on the other side, and I'm sure you're seeing all these studies, whether it's McKinsey, Bain, whether it's Deloitte, BCG, whether it's Weber Shandwick's recent American Pulse survey, Edelman's Trust Barometer, stakeholders want more and more and more engagement on issues, corporate engagement on issues, because they distrust government. They see that government is unethical, incompetent, and they're really looking to companies to fill that leadership void. So where it seems polarizing, and on the other side, it's you're being expected, you're being demanded. You see all of this information or data saying, take a public stand. I will only work for you, buy for you, invest for you if you do these things. And then at the same time, this is happening in this extraordinary moment in time, not just as we look at the development agenda, but also this remarkable transition that's happening in society and in the workforce in particular, whereas millennials and Gen Z are poised to dominate. Millennials right now are the largest by percentage segment of the US workforce. Gen Z are just beginning to enter the workforce. Over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, that is just going to accelerate. Millennials will really, by a percentage, dominate, and that will be these next generation of leaders. That will be the corporate leadership team, the senior leadership teams. Gen Z will enter. Gen Z, if we look at their attitudes and perspectives, as well as millennials relative to boomers, remarkably different. And the same time as sort of the social makeup of society is changing dramatically as well. Gen Z, look at the recent census data, 50% of Gen Z identify as a person of color, 39% of millennials identify as a person of color. Hispanics are the fastest growing segment of the US population. This has the potential to transform business and society. And I realize that this is your workforce of the future. These are your customers. If you're thinking about product innovation, listening to customers, and expanding into new markets, this is what you're operating against. At the same time, you look at it from a communication standpoint, whether it's corporate communications or ESG communications, looking at it through the lens of how do we support our business strategy? How do we align with our values, speak to growth and productivity and innovation in what we're doing in our communities and for our employees in a way that's authentic, but will not alienate, antagonize, create damage to our reputation and trust. And I think we can all conclude that this environment is incredibly complex, it's incredibly challenging. And it's sort of, whenever I'm involved in a project like this, the first thing that I start to ask around when I'm working with a client or working with a company is getting assessment of organizational readiness and institutional will. And what I mean by that, this is something that I learned over the years in terms of it's very easy to look at the data and say people expect that a company is going to take a public stand on something. But you as stewards within your company are going to have a far greater insight into your leadership teams, their expectations, what their willingness is, what they're ready for, what your company culture is ready for. And it really speaks to the types of conversations that you can be having right now and over the course of the coming months and years, and getting that assessment of your company's readiness to insert itself either over the long term or episodically or unexpectedly as issues will percolate or become more intense. So as we think about readiness and will certainly being, once you insert yourself, are you committed to this over the long term? Because you can't take it back. And I know it sounds simple to say this concept of starting where you are, but a big part of this is, and I know Leon will talk about this, is sort of, where are you on your ESG journey? So how evolved are you in terms of the awareness and the understanding and the commitment to ESG and communications around ESG? That's one part of it. But another part of it really speaks to where are you in the organization? And I've had the opportunity and the privilege to work with so many talented people that are responsible for ESG, but not responsible for communications, or responsible for ESG communications, but have to work collaboratively with external communications, internal communications, or Tom, do you have a question? Oh, I saw your hand came up. I didn't know if you were trying to stop me. So, part of it is starting with that assessment as you're thinking about either long-term strategic planning or how to deal episodically with situations that will come up, realizing where are you and who do you need to build or deepen relationships with, how knowledgeable or how much you have to connect the dots in terms of senior leadership's understanding of the importance of these issues. And in another way, it's also getting an understanding of, we do materiality assessments on a somewhat regular basis when we think of ESG reporting and strategic planning, but mapping and assessing these risks across these different issues from a communication standpoint. How are these issues being talked about in your customer markets, in your employee markets? What's happening from a legislative standpoint, from a political standpoint? What's happening in your industry? Are your peers, are companies your size? So really getting a sense of not just the materiality assessment, but where are we and how are these conversations playing out that are relevant to us that we may need to manage, so you can be having those planning conversations and those conversations with senior leadership. Because ultimately, and what I've seen has been successful, is determining this framework for communications. And what I mean by that is the kind of conversations that I think are helpful with senior management is understanding, do we want to be a first mover? Do we want to be a fast follower? Or do we want to be part of the pack that's going to follow along after things happen? So what I mean by that is, whether it is an issue that you want to be a leader on, from a long-term standpoint that's relevant to your company, to your industry, to your community, to your employees, or it could be episodic. Something happens. So a tragedy happens in the marketplace, or a piece of legislation happens, or something happens in a community that inevitably we see some companies will be the first mover to insert themselves into that conversation. They'll be the first to release a statement. They'll be the first to take a public stand. And then we always see a wave of companies that will come very quickly once they've seen that the marketplace and companies are making statements or taking action. Then there's always like a third or fourth wave of companies that catch up. And why is this relevant? Because as you're sitting across the table from senior leadership and they're asking you well, what do we need to do? When do we need to do? How do we need to do it? It's having sort of a guiding framework in terms of, well, do we want to be out there first and shape the marketplace around this, be the first to release a statement, take a leadership position? Do we want to assess how the marketplace is reacting, what companies are saying and doing, to then help us form what we want to say and do? Or do we want to see what really is playing out and then make a statement? And again, there's a matrix to this in terms of how relevant it is, what the issue is, what our customers saying, what our employees saying. But I feel it's helpful for you to have these really thoughtful and strategic conversations with senior leadership to give them a point of view on how you're going to start to cascade or flow out information. I think it's always, sure.
Can I just ask a question there? Sorry to interrupt, but because I think a lot of people will be really interested in how to build that framework. And so it sounds like you're talking about the key criteria being really assessing your different stakeholders, as well as the impact on your business, pro and con. Can you just talk about that criteria just for a second, a little bit?
It's really, it's interesting. It was something that I worked on, and it started when I was at Honeywell, and then the work I continued to do at Edelman was really starting to look at everything from you start to map, obviously you start with your materiality assessment. What are the issues that are important? And then looking at, what are the issues that are being talked about and are relevant in the communities where we live and operate? What our employees are saying, what our customers are saying, what our consumers are saying, what our peers are saying. So you're starting to create this framework, and then you create a decision-making framework, because you may decide to be a first mover on one issue, but be a fast follower on another. One thing that we did, with one company that I was working with is, and ultimately it's that decision-making framework. Well, if it's an issue that happens in our local community where we have a major center of employee operations, we need to be a first mover. If it's an issue that's happening nationally or globally, we may not necessarily need to be a first mover. We may want to see how the marketplace is responding. So it's starting with a set of criteria in terms of what are the issues, where do we operate, what are people saying, what are our customers think, what are stakeholders saying, and then mapping that and getting a sense of, here are the priority issues that we have to be tracking from a communications and issue standpoint and those conversations. If something happens in those issues, and particularly if something happens in those issues in a customer or an employee market, then that could derive our decision-making in terms of whether we do take a stand. Disney's a good example in terms of, you have something that happened in the state of Florida, a controversial bill, Don't Say Gay. Disney is the largest employer in the state of Florida. So they identified that there was an important need for them to be a first mover and a leader on that issue, because it's relevant to their business strategy. It was something that was inconsistent with their core values as a company. It's a large employee market. It's a large market for them. So they need to be a first mover on that. We saw a number of different companies that were fast followers that also released statements and public statements against Don't Say Gay, but they weren't the first and did not want to take that that leadership position. So it's very much a process that you would work with, if you're in the communications function, with internal, external, executive communications. If you're an ESG and you're working with your communications, but you really want to start to have this framework, so that guides planning and allows you to preempt planning in terms of different content, but also having that sense of what you can be tracking so you're not caught by surprise. And I know that these are also things that Liam will talk about. So I'll just look at it more generally. I think one of the most critical things too, and I was working with a client recently, is around demystifying ESG. I know we love, as communicators, when we're talking about these issues, to use lofty language to talk about sustainable development goals and how this is transforming the world. But there's a language of business that is so critical, and there's an education that's necessary internally and externally around connecting this to the work that people are doing in every day. And it's interesting. I've spent the last year traveling around and living in different parts of the country to do research and try to get a pulse of what's happening in a lot of markets around these issues. And people don't speak ESG. People speak around what's happening to them, what's happening in their community, what's relevant to their job, what's relevant to their families, and making sure that as we're cascading information out there in a differentiated narrative, that we're using the language that people use every day. And certainly, I wish I could say something differently, but there's no silver bullet. I mean, this is going to be something that is going to take a lot of work over long periods of time to build trust, to build reputation, particularly if you're talking with your HR teams. They're going to be heavily focused on recruiting and attraction and retention of talent in an ever-diverse marketplace. If you talk to product and sales, they're going to be looking at how do we develop new customer relationships, expand into markets. So all of these conversations are going to take a lot of planning over periods of time. And I think how this maps out, I know this sort of looks small on a screen. It probably would have looked better if I'd been in a boardroom. But the way, and sort of to summarize some of these things, you start with your core values and your business strategy. And then you start to think about issue map mapping, stakeholder mapping, like getting a sense of what's being talked about, what are our customers saying, what are our employees saying, what are our community saying, how do we build that differentiating narrative and that content engine? And then there's going to be no shortage of ways. And as we all know, as communicators and practitioners, that it's going to be critical to be cascading and socializing and distributing this information across an entire portfolio, which sort of gets back to where are you in the organization, and do you start to need to build relationships to have stronger allies within your company to help get this information, to help you when you want to be telling these stories, and how you're tracking and measuring. So it's, sort of gets into the, fundamentally, assessing your organizational readiness and will to be going through these different processes in a period of time, which is going to be certainly increasingly complex as the political campaigns ramp up. And let me sort of pause there and turn it over to Leon. And I'll do the slides too. So just say next slide when you're ready.
Sure, go on ahead. Right. So I want to build upon, I thought you brought up a great point, how, Michael, a lot of people don't even understand the whole concept of ESG. And I think that is a huge challenge that we face. And also, one challenge is that, for example, on this webcast, we're all in one form or another CSR practitioners speaking to CSR practitioners. And one thing that I firmly believe is that when we talk about these challenges, I think we need to be able to talk about them to our peers, people like our parents, our friends, people out in our community that aren't necessarily, working in this space. Because if you can explain it to them, then you can do wonders, for your clients when you come across these situations. So I can't see you all out there. Tom will have to speak for me. So raise your hand if you've been asked that question. Well, what do you think about this whole woke capitalism thing? Wait. Raise your hand. Did anybody raise their hand? Oh, they're all checking their email like I have during other webinars. That's okay. I'll give you a pass. I mean, so again, Michael gave you he gave what I feel is a really great, like, boardroom type response. I'm going to give you more of a boardwalk, Atlantic City, Ocean City, Santa Cruz type of response, or ability response. When people ask me, well, what do you think about this whole, woke capitalism thing? I reply, well, I don't think about it. Or I quote one of my favorite lines that's just in about every Netflix series: it's not a thing. And here's why. I mean, I'll just put it very simply. If it ain't woke, don't fix it, right? I mean, there's nothing woke about having a supply chain that's far more energy efficient and is saving your company money because you've rooted out all those inefficiencies, right? There's nothing woke about having very high employee retention and low turnover and people are happy and you're getting on those, lists that all companies want to be on, like the best places to work and so forth, right? I mean, a lot of the companies' work out there is not, I wouldn't describe it as woke. We all know, for those of us that have been in the space a while, it's because it's for the bottom line. These companies tend to be ranked better by their employees and their peer companies. They tend to be more profitable. They tend to have less, what I like to call, these social media flare-ups. They tend to have better reputations overall. Investors are investing in them because they've seen that they future-proofed their business. So I think, one thing we saw with Disney, with this whole anti-woke capitalism and all the chatter we're hearing out there, you have to future-proof your business because the goalposts are moving all the time anyway, right?
So Leon,
Disney.
I'm going to interrupt here because we did get a question earlier about,
Sure.
From both of you, would love to hear what you think is woke and anti-woke. And this person was, also asking about the subcontext. What do we think people are referring to really? Because I think obviously there are people out there that are trying to define woke and anti-woke and what that means. But what do you think the core issues are that are getting people upset and angry, or what do you think is driving some of this? And you can come to this later, but I wanted to put it out there for both of you. And let's make sure we get to that at some point.
So one way I can get, because I'll be honest right now, I don't know what anti-woke or anti-woke or woke capitalism is, because quite frankly, I have never really seen a definition that I can wrap my head around. I think Michael alluded to this, where it's like, I think what it comes down to is a lot of these ESG concepts, to those of us that are not in the space, they're just very nebulous. It's just hard to wrap your head around. It's like, it's like for someone like me that's not an engineer or deeply vested in the scientific field, like, I don't know what these things are. I kind of understand them, but I don't, right? So I think to get back to how you get around this, I like how Michael mentioned, you got to map out your risk. None of this, what has happened over the past couple of years, just emerged suddenly or in a vacuum. And actually, I'm going to recommend a book. And if you want to find me on social or what have you, the name of the book is Inherent Negatives. It was written by the late James Rubin, who's a business professor at UVA, and Barry Carmichael, who's a senior advisor at APCO that I worked with. And it was written about 5 years ago. And what, to give you the 3-floor elevator speech, what this book about is that these things you've heard about in the past that are analogous to what Disney went through. Again, they just didn't come out of nowhere. Something was broken along the chain within the company, right? Within the structure that allowed this thing to happen. And I think so, Disney, why I go, and again, if you thought Michael may have sounded flippant, for a moment or two, I'm going to probably come across as bonkers, but I'll be very honest. I know that in our personal and professional lives, we've always been told it's not what you say, but it's how you say it. But when companies are communicating their ESG, it's not the how, it's the what. So the problem that Disney had is that everything was going down with DeSantis, the don't say gay bill, and at least from the LGBTQ community's point of view, especially, there was definitely a delayed response. They came across as reactive, and when you come across as reactive, in my opinion, that makes things even worse, because it made it sound like Disney was suddenly backpedaling, right? My response to that, however, is that why I often say if it ain't woke, don't fix it, or I don't think about it, is because fast forward several months later, last I heard is that Disney is investing, multi-billion dollars into their amusement parks part of the business, right? In a few words, they're going to be fine. And so I think part of the problem here is where you need to focus on the what, is that I have found, especially from an editor's perspective, where I would get these pitches where companies trying to talk, they're getting so tied up in knots trying to define their work as purpose or corporate citizenship, corporate social responsibility, now ESG is the lexicon. I think they're so focused on how to put themselves in the box that the meaning of what they were doing, what was lost. And so I would just say, if you're on your ESG, if you're already on this ESG journey, own it. You go forward with it. You should have had and that's why I'm recommending that book, Inherent Negatives. You should have had these processes in place already so you can respond and be resilient in case suddenly there's some attack, out of nowhere that your executives are viewing as a threat to your business. But again, I think Michael alluded to this, you got to think on the long term, right? Because investors want to see that you future-proof your business. Your employees want to see that you're committed to your values. And, this is a very old tenet of CSR, but, companies should be doing good work that is core to their business anyway, because I'm forgetting a lot of my MBA class speaks, their core competencies, right? Like, do the work that is central to your company anyway, because you're good at it and there'll be a benefit. So, I mean, again, because what I found is that we have read how a lot of companies are back, pedaling. They're suddenly trying to redefine ESG, or they're trying to completely blow up their sustainability strategy, or just redefining it. It's you need to be, it sounds very simplistic, but I would just say, again, you've got to be proactive. I think it's when companies are reactive and they come across as reactive, that's when the crows descend, right? That's when the locusts come, and that's when these companies get into problems. But is it a huge issue? I'm not convinced it is, because again, we're all like lauding and picking on Disney at the same time, but look how they've recovered from this, right? You need to have those processes in place. What I would say is that if suddenly your company says, well, we're not going to call it corporate sustainability or CSR, we're going to call it ESG, you might want to backpedal, because I don't think this is going to completely go away. But if you're on that journey, I think you need to own your journey, because in the end, your stakeholders are going to respect you for what you're doing in the long run. I think when companies fall into that trap of short-termism, that's where the problem lies. So if we can flip to the next slide, that'd be great. And I think bottom line also, I mean, this is getting a little off topic, but one challenge I think why companies get tied up in knots and suddenly they fall prey to this whole anti-capitalism, anti-woke speak, is that what I will say as a criticism, and this is something I've observed, and this is something I believe, I don't think, Michael's made it very clear, there's not one out of the box solution for all of these, but I think it's really important to communicate your accomplishments. What have you done? Right? And quite frankly, from a pragmatic earned media perspective, this is how you're going to get news. If your client or your company is just hell bent on getting that earned media, because you know what, some things, that train has left the station, right? I'm just thinking out loud, like net zero, having a certain amount of your executives, a certain demographic by a certain year. Again, it's like, if a lot of these, they're goals that there's often no follow through, but if you have good tangible results, that's what you need to communicate. And this goes at one trend we've seen, and this has gone on for a couple of years now. Everyone's talking about this green hushing. Maybe we shouldn't publicize what you're doing. My response to that is, you don't really have a clear plan and you're talking about these far off objectives, or if you're just speaking in generalities, or I'll even be harsh enough to say platitudes, I think that's where you can get in trouble. But if you're doing good work and if you have the data to back it up, it's not, don't green hush. It's not, don't hush it. Again, talk about those rankings, talk about how satisfied your employees are. Talk about, again, I don't like to fall into business speak, talk about how, if you can point to examples of how sustainability can foster a culture of synergy and innovation, and you have the results to prove that, show it. Certainly don't hush it up. And again, to stand out, we're always trying to find a new way to stand out, right? Companies are looking for a way to pull themselves out of the crowd. I think the E in ESG, that is done. If you don't have some kind of plan for net zero, which there's been a lot of pushback anyway, I think you've missed out. I think what's really important right now, and this we could be here all day, but we don't have all day. But that S part, I think, is important. And I think part of the question is, why is there this anti-ESG, anti-woke capitalism going on? Is that, I don't want to get too political here, but there is a big part of the population here in the US, for whatever reason, they feel like they've been overlooked. They feel like they've been left behind. So that's what they feel. We can go back and forth to say if it's accurate or not, but that is the perception out there. And those of us that work in communications, a lot of it is about perception, right? So perhaps you need to focus on some, really solid social type work, that S and SEG, that is aligned with your company's core competencies, that's aligned with what your company does really well, and that your employees believe in. So can we pop over to the next slide? Sure. So again, I mean, bottom line, again, I just think CSR needs to be a core value. I tried to come up with this clever thing, and now I'm looking at it and I don't know if it's really clever, but you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Your CSR, your ESG program, whatever you're talking about it's like the saying goes, the sum needs to be greater than the sum of its parts. I think if your company is looking to CSR as sustainability as like a band-aid to mask a problem, that is where you can also get in trouble, because that's also a risk of, hey, you're being woke, or whatever the term is. I think I have one more slide, right? So, when I talk about if they don't woke, don't fix it, I'm just going to talk about, some companies' work that I know very well of. That's a great example. I mean, there's nothing woke about a software company that is opening opportunities to entrepreneurs of certain demographics, entrepreneurs of color, right, and of women. They're not funding them. They're just basically introducing these really cool companies, small startups, to their customers. So they have an opportunity to crack into the marketplace. There's a major building company, here in the US, they're doling out grants across the US to community colleges, because this is a perfect example. It's a building company, solving a problem and a need. What is the problem? We don't have enough people that are in the skilled trades right now. Any of you that's trying to renovate your kitchen, you're probably on the long waiting list, right? At the same time, there are a lot of students, and this ties into Michael's talk about, what's going on with the Gen Z generation. A lot of them are rethinking the whole traditional high school to college route because college is so absurdly expensive now. They don't want to go into debt. They can become an apprentice. They can get a great paying job. And, a lot of them will probably in a few years probably be making more money than any of us on this call right now. That is just the hard truth. And these are not small brands. These are into the six figures. Some of them are even approaching $1 million. They're going to community colleges, so you're covering many bases, right? You're opening doors to people of color and women who aren't necessarily in the skilled trades. They're funding these in small. A lot of these are in smaller cities, rural areas where, again, they're not expecting to get coverage by the like of the LA Times, New York Times, or the San Francisco paper. So bottom line, if your company is in a position to solve a problem, and I know I'm sounding very simplistic, but I always tell people, like, man, like, don't talk to me like I'm a CSR practitioner. Like, talk to me like I'm at a cocktail party, or talk to me like you would talk to your parents to explain this. Don't dumb it down, but just like talk in English, so people understand what's going on. So a not so great example, I'm really trying to hard name names, but I saw this a lot during the whole George Floyd after what happened to George Floyd, 3.5 years ago, all of a sudden these companies, that were whiter than like these three guys here in the call, all of a sudden they're talking about like diversity and we're going to increase our ranks. And, my response was like, you've never been committed to this before. I bet you I can vet their press statements and they've never followed up on this. And, meanwhile, I have one company in mind where, like, the Washington Post, I think the Times has written about this, like, nobody likes our printers because of the whole razor blade model where it's like the printer's cheap, but then, the printers are like a second mortgage on your home, right? So bottom line, I think companies, when they're trying to go something that's out of their box to try to mask some core problem to your business, that puts you at risk. And again, I'm just going to shameless plug the book by James Rubin and Barry Carmichael. You should read it. It'll give you solid understanding. So that's my perspective. Again, to be clear, like Michael, there is no out of the box solution, but I think bottom line it's not about reacting or how to cope with this anti-woke. It's to really, I hate that word, but I'm just going to say it because I can't think of a better one at 9:30 in the morning, future-proof your business so that you are ready to deal with these unexpected news stories that, can blight your company's reputation. But in the end, if you're focused on the long game, I mean, you'll be fine. I said this really flippantly the other day, but there's a core truth for it. I'm like, the goal, the thing is that it's hard to be completely ready for a movement that seems to be changing the goalposts, right? Because even I'm finding 6 months later, a lot of this chatter about, states pulling their pension funds out of certain companies like BlackRock because they didn't like their woke ESG policies, that's tampered a bit. I said this on the phone to somebody, and I probably shouldn't repeat it. I'm like, oh my God, like your company, you're not going to deal with this. Like this crowd, now they're just like, going to go after like, gay people and Middle Eastern people like me. But you'll be fine. I mean, again, probably not the most polished thing to say, but there's an element of truth in that. Bottom line, you need to have those processes in place that Michael spoke to. And that is how you prepare yourself to be in this environment, because it's not, I think this is the new normal, whether we like it or not.
Great. Thank you, Leon. Thank you, Michael.
Sure.
We've got about 20 minutes for questions. I've got a couple here for everybody who is attending and listening. Please feel free to put a question in the Q&A and we'll get to it. We have an interesting one here. Leon, you talked in your last example about the Silicon Valley company and DEI. This person says, I agree with everything being said. However, the speakers aren't addressing the fact that companies are being sued for certain DEI practices right now. And I think it is one of the sort of core issues, I think, of wokeness that companies are feeling pressure about. And I think your example, Leon, is interesting because I do think a lot of the companies, many companies have did something very quickly after George Floyd, but to your point, not substantively. And it's they really weren't addressing the core issue and they didn't know how to do it. It doesn't mean that they don't need to be doing something there, as this person is pointing out. So I'm just wondering if this is sort of a broad question for both of you, about the range of issues that these companies are getting pressure around. Diversity is obviously one of the biggest issues. And I'm just wondering, as you've seen the reactions of these companies and their need to address a core issue like DEI, can you give us some examples or talk about the companies that are doing it well? And for the Silicon Valley company, it may be obviously need to be a long-term approach that is going to address the core issue, but it doesn't mean they should abandon it. So I'm just curious if either or both of you have a thought about DEI, especially since what we're seeing on the landscape now is that many companies are sort of backing away from what they originally started to do because they're getting pressure from the outside of it.
So it's a great question. Do I have like the perfect rapid fire response? No, because depending on how far along, if it goes to the Supreme Court or not yet, will it redefine everything? Yes, it could. So I'm not an attorney. I don't have a legal answer, but I can give you an example of how this was addressed. So that program I was talking about, dispersing grants. I was in a session, and I'm not going to name the company because I didn't ask if I could, and I don't think they'd want me to, this building and construction company, but they did have a culture where they were very skittish about talking about DEI just because of the community they were in, and they were also sensitive to all of this. And a short story of this saga that went on is that we're on these calls. How do we communicate it? How do we communicate it? And finally, I just said, hey, everybody, like bottom line, we're talking about we need 20th century skills for a 21st century economy. That's it. And they were able, and most of these grants, by the way, went to communities of color, indigenous rural areas, especially. And so I know it might sound kind of dodgy, but just not addressing it online. But yeah, I mean, companies are going to have to figure out what they're going to do internally to address this issue, because I don't know how it's going to play out in the courts.
Yeah.
And it might sound, again, I love that word dodgy, that we're just putting in a different box. But I said, well, it's coming with a way that communicates this. Who's going to argue with training people to do very good, solid jobs that aren't going to put them in college debt, right? And at the same time, it went to all these. Who's going to argue with funding colleges in rural areas, and that meet the needs of various communities? So that is one example I can give you. I mean, we're still in uncharted territory there, so I don't have the perfect answer. Yeah, if the Supreme Court blows up these rules and all of a sudden companies can be sued, I don't have the answer for that. But I mean, companies have always had to respond to changes in regulations, changes in the legal environment. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when, seat belts, gas mileage, things like that were like a non-starter, for auto companies. And look what's happened now. There are ways to get around it. I don't mean to dismiss the concern, considering I come from a demographic that's been under attack, especially with what's been going on the past week, but there are ways to go about it. So
Michael, what, your thoughts on this? And Leon, you brought up another point that I think I referenced earlier. In addition to lawsuits, there are regulations coming from the SEC. I mean, there's a question here of how companies need to get ahead of an issue too, instead of just being reactive. Do you have any thoughts about this one, Michael?
Sure, very quickly, because I know we probably other questions. And I'll try to tackle a few questions that were in there. So one thing that I find is interesting, if you go back to the Disney with Anheuser-Busch and the Bud Light campaign. So you had a situation where conservative media and conservative politicians were out there leading the charge against Bud Light and what Bud Light was looking at doing in terms of reaching a younger, a more diverse and a younger consumer base to drive growth. And then the flip side of that is the Florida Pension Fund. The Florida Pension Fund took a massive hit because they had invested in Anheuser-Busch. So after leading the charge, and now DeSantis is in a position where he's called for an investigation into Anheuser-Busch as a way to try to save face for a situation that, because you could argue the conservative media created and conservative politicians created. So, and it's certainly how these things play out in the courts. No one really knows. I was going to bring up the point around the SEC. I mean, there's going to be new requirements in terms of diversity. I think, and very quickly to address that question that came in from before, I think, at least from my perspective, I think when I hear anti-ESG, I think what people are really talking about is corporate engagement on climate and trying to solve climate change as a global issue. Because I look at it like, well, who would be against community engagement? Who would be against operating legally and adhering to regulations and having systems and process? I think when I hear anti-woke, I think it's code for anti-diversity, anti-DEI. I feel it's anti-LGBTQ community. So I feel like what happens is these terms, when we think about what anti-ESG is and what it's code for and what anti-woke is and what a woke company is, I think there's a nuance there. Building on some of the things that Liam was saying, I think when you take that perspective, then I look at it like you're anti-growth, you're anti your community, you're anti your employees, because this is where the marketplace is moving. I remember years ago when I was in corporate communications at Honeywell, when the anti-globalization movement was very powerful and really driving in the aughts, I guess would be called, attacks on companies as we were looking at growing internationally and moving operations internationally. So there was a lot of criticism, lawsuits and everything. And now globalization is, operating internationally and driving growth internationally is fundamental to the success of multinational companies. But we went through a period of time of almost 8 to 10 years where we were under attack and trying to figure out, well, how do we respond to all this? And so much of it was, some of the things that Leanna was saying is that we talk in the language of business about our growth strategy, about our brand reputation in these marketplaces. So I think that these things go in cycles and waves, and how these things play out in legally, we have no idea.
But let's test that a little bit, or push back. I'm not pushing back, but taking Anheuser-Busch as an example, because they obviously took a huge hit. Leon talked about how Disney is doing fine now, and maybe Anheuser-Busch will be doing great in the future. I think the question that maybe people are thinking about is, everybody on this call, I'm sure, agrees that the companies need to do the right thing. The question, I think, is, to your point earlier, Michael, when do you get out ahead of it? When do you really need to talk about it, promote it, speak about it, versus maybe just keeping it internal and keeping it quiet? Because obviously, some companies can talk about what they're doing and get a lot of kudos and new customers and business, and employees will love it. And then there are the issues that are just so difficult, and are going to draw attention, negative, in Anheuser-Busch's case, negative attention. So how do you really think about that? Because you talked about this earlier, Michael, and I'm going to start with you. Something may look good on the matrix or the framework and make sense as far as an issue for the company to get behind, but it may be it may not be something that should be communicated broadly or forcefully. And I'm just wondering, how do you figure out that nuance or that subtlety to an issue that is the right thing to do, but may bring some real backlash and really hurt the company?
It's certainly complicated, and there's also another avenue here, which I've worked with some companies, sort of the approach of getting caught doing the right thing, which is using third parties and partners to be out there talking about what the company is doing. So the company is not driving communications; it's also creating sort of, I call, creating awareness in the marketplace from other people, validating what the company is doing. But so much of it really starts with what I'll call like the look them in the eye conversations. It's really pressing hard on these issues, their relevance, their importance, the importance of the business strategy. It's talking internally with employees and understanding employee sentiment. It's getting a perspective in communities. So if we're thinking about it from a long-term risk management standpoint, it can't be haphazard. It really needs to be done in a way that is going to create a risk assessment and understanding these hot button issues, and then really beginning to filter through, and in terms of scenario planning and beginning to understand what could there be the reaction in the marketplace, what do our employees think. So having that pulse of the employees, I think it becomes so monumental. But I know I said it before, it really comes down to the organizational readiness. And if you don't have that readiness, if you feel like there's a hesitation, then it may not be to be that first mover. It may not be to be the company that's trying to be out there as a leader and be the one that's going to be attacked and targeted. You may want to approach a fast follower to see how people respond. Sure. And really each of these things is going to be even more dynamic when it becomes episodic of something that happens, whether it's a tragedy or a piece of legislation or a proposition. But I think you should start long-term having that matrix and having that grid and really understanding the vulnerabilities, but also you flip it on in terms of the opportunities. Target was attacked for what they were doing during Pride Month, but their sales are recovering, and the threat to their business is not about what they did in Pride Month, but supply chain issues and inflation. So I think as we start to think about, people can argue, you can take a position that, this is a very significantly large percentage of the American population is LGBTQ. You could argue that it's essentially if you look at it from a population standpoint, it's equal to the population of New York, or you could probably take the 10 least like states 40 to 50. So why would you take a position to alienate a significant part of the population if you are a consumer facing business? So here you have a situation where they were attacked and their sales are recovering.
Yeah.
Yeah. This might sound very like almost too cold and pragmatic, but in terms of communicating this, how to communicate it, what to communicate it. I mean, most of the folks on this call, I assume, are on the reporting side. They do a lot with ESG reports or sustainability reports, right? Writing them, doing the materiality assessments and so forth. Correct? Sorry if that sounds like a stupid question, but you'll see the point that I'm getting. And this gets back to, for example, the building company that I worked with. Let's reverse engineer this a bit, okay? I'm not the SEC expert that I used to be when I used to sell financial data, but a very important part of that 10K, the annual report, is that item 7 MD&A, where companies have to put risks to their business, all right? So companies don't put on their websites, oh, by the way, our risk is that we source one, material, but we rely on one material. It's in this one country at risk of war. And if something happens there, or if they shut the borders, things are going to be really hit, right? They have to disclose it, but they're not like petting it in bright lights and, fancy font on their website, right? What I'm saying is a lot of this is going to be disclosed anyway. You're disclosing it in your ESG report. And that gets back to the building company. Again, they came from a culture where, they just had a lot of concerns. I mean, they're doing it. They're just choosing how and where to communicate this. Right. So it sounds like I'm putting a Band-Aid on the problem and I'm sounding very cold and pragmatic. I can see how somebody would say, so you're basically saying like, don't talk about how you have this aggressive, program to hire people of color from the LGBTQ community. But sorry, I haven't finished my coffee and I'm feeling it right now. But it's really gets back down to how you're communicating this and where it's out there. Anyway.
Thank you. So we've just got a few more minutes. Yeah, it makes total sense. Let's end with just a few final thoughts from each of you. Any sort of high-level thoughts or tips or recommendations that you want to leave our attendees with? Anything you want to mention? Michael, let's start with you. that you haven't mentioned or you want to accentuate a little bit?
I would just say very quickly, start having those internal conversations with your leadership team around the need to be prepared. Both how can you extend or accelerate or intensify the communications that you're doing that's going to align with your business strategy and your brand, but how do you prepare and beginning to prepare for what could be episodic or situational things that come up over the course of particularly this next year. You don't want to be caught flat-footed, and the more that you can be doing now and driving those internal conversations and having those look them in the eye moments with senior leaders is only going to set you up for better performance and more likelihood of success when it gets intense.
Makes sense. Great. Thank you. Leon, final thoughts?
I mean, look, this is very hard. If you're very, it's not an easy time to, I don't mean to, diminish people's concerns at all. I'm personally affected by this. It's heavy, it's hard, it's making our work a challenge. And I think that what Michael said is, it's more about future proofing. It's being prepared and having the structure in place in the first place, right? So, I'm going to age myself here, but I want to end this on a light note. So I keep thinking back to like those early 90s SNL skits where Dana Carvey played George Bush, and he would be in the debates against the guy playing Clinton. He would just say, "Stay the course, stay the course." That's like the only thing he said. Stay the course, stay the course. I mean, because I say this all the time in your personal and business life. Don't take the bait. Bottom line, don't take the bait. When you take the bait, you lose.
That makes total sense.
And if you have a great structure in place, and if you have smart people, and I really liked what Michael said, if this is embedded across the organization, if everybody feels like they're a part of this, if everybody knows what's going on, you're going to hit massive bumps. You might even hit your head on the top of your car. It's going to hurt. It's going to be uncomfortable, but you will get to that destination.
Great. Well, great final thoughts. And thank you both. This was so interesting.
Sure.
We could talk for another couple hours about this, I'm sure. And for all the attendees, we really appreciate your insights and your thoughts. And if anybody who's still on the call has any future questions, just send them our way. We will get them answered for you from Leon and Michael. And please join us for our next webinar on November 16th at 12 noon, where we start exploring some of the frameworks and standards that are very much related to what we talked about today with another one of our talented consultants. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in November. Michael and Leon, have a great day. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Everybody, thanks for dialing in.
Bye-bye.
Bye.